We had arranged to meet at the apartment and have a cocktail before starting. I arrived before Larry. I was taking them to a very smart restaurant and expected to find Isabel arrayed for the occasion. With all the women dressed to the nines, I was confident she would not wish to be outshone. But she had on a plain woolen frock. "Gray's got one of his headaches," she said. "He's in agony. I can't possibly leave him." I told the cook she could go out when she'd given the children their supper, and I must make something for him myself and try to get him to take it. You and Larry had better go alone. "Is Gray in bed?" "No. He won't ever go to bed when he has his headaches. God knows it's the only place for him, but he won't. He's in the library." This was a little paneled room, brown and gold, that Elliot had found in an old chateau. The books were protected from anyone who wanted to read them by gilt lattice work and locked up, but this was perhaps as well, as they consisted for the most part of illustrated pornographic works of the 18th century. In their contemporary Morocco, however, they made a very pretty effect. Isabel led me in. Gray was sitting humped up in a big leather chair with picture papers scattered on the floor beside him. His eyes were closed, and his usually red face had a gray pallor. He was evident that he was in great pain. He tried to get up, but I stopped him. "Have you given him any aspirin?" I asked Isabel. "That never does any good. I have an American prescription, but that doesn't help either." "Oh, don't bother, darling," said Gray. "I shall be all right tomorrow." He tried to smile. "I'm sorry to make such a nuisance of myself," he said to me. "You all go out to the boys." "I wouldn't dream of it," said Isabel. "Do you think I should enjoy myself when I knew you were suffering the tortures of the damned?" "Poor slut, I think she loves me," said Gray, his eyes closed. Then his face was suddenly contorted, and you could almost see the lancinating pain that pierced his head. The door was softly opened, and Larry stepped in. Isabel told him what was the matter. "Oh, I am sorry," he said, giving Gray a look of commiseration. "Isn't there anything one can do to relieve him?" "Nothing," said Gray, his eyes still closed. "The only thing you can, any of you, do for me is to leave me alone. Get off and have a good time by yourself." I thought myself that was the only sensible course to take, but I didn't suppose Isabel could square it with her conscience. "Will you let me see if I can help you?" asked Larry. "No one can help me," said Gray wearily. "It's just killing me, and sometimes I wish to God it would." I was wrong in saying that perhaps I could help you. What I meant is that perhaps I could help you help yourself. Gray slowly opened his eyes and looked at Larry. "How can you do that?" Larry took what looked like a silver coin out of his pocket and put it in Gray's hand. "Close your fingers on it tightly and hold your hand palm downward. Don't fight against me. Make no effort, but hold the coin in your clenched fist. Before I count 20, your hand will open and the coin will drop out of it." Gray did as he was told. Larry seated himself at the writing table and began to count. Isabel and I remained standing. 1, 2, 3, 4, till he got up to 15. There was a movement in Gray's hand, and it seemed to tremble a little, and I had the impression, I can hardly say I saw, that the clenched fingers were loosening. The thumb moved away from the fist. I distinctly saw the fingers quiver. When Larry reached 19, the coin fell out of Gray's hand and rolled to my feet. I picked it up and looked at it. It was heavy and misshapen. In bold relief on one side was a youthful head, which I recognized as that of Alexander the Great. Gray stared at his hand with perplexity. I didn't let the coin drop, he said. It fell of itself. He was sitting with the right arm resting on the arm of the leather chair. Are you quite comfortable in that chair? Asked Larry. As comfortable as I can be when my head's giving me hell. Well, let yourself go quite slack. Take it easy. Do nothing. Don't resist. Before I count 20, your right arm will rise from the arm of the chair until your hand is above your head. 1, 2, 3, 4. He spoke the number slowly in that silver-toned, melodious voice of his, and when he had reached 9, he saw Gray's hand rise only just perceptibly from the leather surface of which it rested until it was perhaps an inch above it. It stopped for a second. 10, 11, 12. There was a little jerk, and slowly the whole arm began to move upward. It wasn't resting on the chair anymore. Isabel, a little scared, took hold of my hand. It was a curious effect. It had no likeness to a voluntary movement. I've never seen a man walking in his sleep, but I can imagine that he would move in just the same strange way that Gray's arm moved. It didn't look as though the will were the motive power. I should have thought it would be hard to raise the arm so slowly and so evenly by a conscious effort. It gave me the impression that a subconscious force, independent of the mind, was raising it. It was the same sort of movement as that of a piston, moving very slowly back and forth in a cylinder. 15, 16, 17. The words fell, slow, 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 like drops of water in a basin from the effective tap. Gray's arm rose, till his hand was above his head, and as Larry reached the number he had said, it fell of its own weight onto the arm of the chair. I didn't lift my arm, said Gray. I couldn't help it rising. It did that of its own accord. Larry faintly smiled. It's of no consequence. I thought it might give you confidence in me. Where's that great coin? I gave it to him. Hold it in your hand. Gray took it. Larry glanced at his watch. It's 13 minutes past 8. In 60 seconds, your eyelids will grow so heavy that you'll be obliged to close them, and then you'll sleep. You'll sleep for 6 minutes. At 8:20, you'll awake, and you'll have no more pain. Neither Isabel nor I spoke. Our eyes were on Larry. He said nothing more. He fixed his gaze on Gray, but did not seem to look at him. He seemed rather to look through and beyond him. There was something eerie in the silence that fell upon us. It was like the silence of flowers in a garden at nightfall. Suddenly I felt Isabel's hand tighten. I glanced at Gray. His eyes were closed. He was breathing easily and regularly. He was asleep. We stood there for a time that seemed interminable. I badly wanted a cigarette, but I did not like to light one. Larry was motionless. His eyes looked into I knew not what distance. Except that they were open, he might have been in a trance. Suddenly he appeared to relax. His eyes took on their normal expression, and he looked at his watch. As he did so, Gray opened his eyes. Gosh, he said, I believe I dropped off to sleep. Then he started. I noticed that his face had lost its ghostly pallor. My headache's gone. That's fine, said Larry. Have a cigarette, then we'll all go out to dinner. It's a miracle. I feel perfectly swell. How did you do it? I didn't do it. You did it yourself. Isabel went to change, and meanwhile Gray and I drank a cocktail. Though it was plain that Larry did not wish to, Gray insisted on talking of what had just happened. He couldn't make it out at all. I didn't believe you could do such a thing, he said. I just gave in because I felt too lousy to argue. He went on to describe the onset of headaches, the anguish he endured, and the wreck he was when the attack subsided. He could not understand how it was that just then he felt his usual robust self. Isabel came back. She was wearing a dress I had not seen before. It reached the ground, a white sheath of what I think is called murricane, with a flare of black tulle, and I could not but think she would be a credit to us. It was very gay at the Chateau de Madrid, and we were in high spirits. Larry talked amusing nonsense in a way I had not heard him do before, and he made us laugh. I had a notion he was doing this with the idea of diverting our minds from the exhibition of his unexpected power. But Isabel was a determined woman. She was prepared to play ball with him as long as it suited her convenience, but she did not lose sight of her desire to satisfy her curiosity. When we had finished dinner and were drinking coffee and liqueurs, and she might well have supposed that the good food, the one glass of wine he drank, and the friendly talk he had weakened his defenses, she fixed her bright eyes on Larry. Now tell us how you cured Gray's headaches. You saw for yourself, he answered, smiling. Did he learn that sort of thing in India? Yes. He suffers agonies. Do you think you could cure him permanently? I don't know. I might be able to. It would make a difference in his whole life. He couldn't expect to hold a decent job when he may be incapacitated for 48 hours. He'll never be happy until he's at work again. I can't work miracles, But it was a miracle. I saw it with my own eyes. No, it wasn't. I merely put an idea in old Gray's head, and he did the rest himself. He turned to Gray. What are you doing tomorrow? Playing golf. I'll look in at 6 and we'll have a talk. Then, giving Isabel his winning smile, I haven't danced with you for 10 years, Isabel. Would you care to see if I still know how to? After that, we saw a good deal of Larry. For the next week, he came to the apartment every day, and for half an hour shut himself up with Gray in the library. It appeared that he wanted to persuade him, that was how he smilingly put it, out of having those shattering megrims, and Gray conceived a childlike trust in him. From the little Gray said, I got the idea he was trying, beside, to restore his broken confidence in himself. About 10 days later, Gray had another headache, and it so happened that Larry was not to come until the evening. It was not a very bad one, but Gray was so confident now in Larry's odd power that he thought if Larry could be got hold of, he could take it away in a few minutes. But neither I, whom Isabel called on the phone, nor they knew where he lived. And Larry had at last came and relieved Gray of his pain. Gray asked him for his address, and said in case of need he could summon him at once. Larry smiled. Call the American Express and leave a message. I'll call them every morning. Isabel asked me later why Larry made a secret of his address. He had done that before, and then he had turned out that he lived without any mystery in a third-rate hotel in the Latin Quarter. I haven't a notion, I said in answer. I can only suggest something very fanciful, and there's probably nothing in it. It may be that some queer instinct urges him to carry over to his dwelling place some privacy of a spirit. What in God's name do you mean by that? He cried irritably. Hasn't it struck you that when he's with us, easy as he is to get on with, friendly and sociable, one's conscious of a sort of detachment in him, as though he weren't giving all himself, but withheld in some hidden part of his soul something, I don't know what it is, a tension, a secret, an aspiration, a knowledge that sets him apart. I've known Larry all my life, she said impatiently. Sometimes he reminds me of a great actor playing perfectly a part in a trumpery play like Eleonora Duse and Lola Condera. Isabel pondered over this for a moment. I suppose I know what you mean. One's having fun and one thinks he's just like one of us, just like everybody else, and then suddenly you have the feeling he's escaped you like a smoke ring that you try to catch in your hands. What do you think it can be that makes him so queer? Perhaps something so commonplace that one simply doesn't notice it, such as, well, goodness, for instance. Isabel frowned. I wish you wouldn't say things like that. It gives me a nasty feeling in the pit of my stomach. Or is it a little pain in the depth of your heart? Isabel gave me a long look as though she were trying to read my thoughts. She took a cigarette from the table beside her and, lighting it, leaned back on her chair. She watched a smoke curl up in the air. Do you want me to go? I asked. No. I was silent for a moment, watching her, and took my pleasure in the contemplation of her shapely nose and exquisite line of her jaw. Are you very much in love with Larry? God damn you, I never loved anyone else in all my life. Why did you marry Gray? I had to marry somebody. He was mad about me, and Mama wanted me to marry him. Everybody told me I was well rid of Larry. I was very fond of Gray. I'm very fond of him still. You don't know how sweet he is. No one in the world could be so kind and so considerate. He looks as though he had an awful temper, doesn't he? With me, he's always been angelic. When we had money, he wanted me to want things so that he could have the pleasure of giving them to me. Once I said it would be fun if we could have a yacht and go around the world, and if the crash hadn't come, he'd have bought me one. He sounds almost too good to be true, I murmured. We had a grand time. I shall always be grateful to him for that. He made me very happy. I looked up at her but did not speak. I suppose I didn't really love him, but one can get on all right without love. At the bottom of my heart, I hankered for Larry, but as long as I didn't see him, it didn't really bother me. Do you remember saying to me that with 3,000 miles of ocean between, the pangs of love become quite tolerable? I thought it a cynical remark, but of course it's true. If it's a pain to see Larry, don't you think it would be wiser not to see him? But it's a pain that's heaven. Besides, you know what he is. Any day he may vanish like a shadow when the sun goes, and we may not see him again for years. Have you never thought of divorcing Gray? I've got no reason for divorcing him. That doesn't prevent you countrywomen from divorcing their husbands when they have a mind to. She laughed. Why do you suppose they do it? Don't you know? Because American women expect to find in their husbands a perfection that English women only hope to find in their butlers. Isabel gave her head such a haughty toss that I wondered she didn't get a crick in the neck. Because Gray isn't articulate, you think there's nothing to him? You're wrong there, I interrupted quickly. I think there's something rather moving about him. He has wonderful faculty of love. One has only to glance at his face when he's looking at you to see how deeply, how devotedly he's attached to you. He loves his children much more than you do. I suppose you're going to say now that I'm not a good mother. On the contrary, I think you're an excellent mother. You see that they're well and happy. You watch over their diet and take care that their bowels act regularly. You teach them to behave nicely, and you read to them and make them say their prayers. If they were sick, you'd send for a doctor at once and nurse them with care. But you're not wrapped up in them as Gray is. It's unnecessary that one should be. I'm a human being and I treat them as human beings. A mother only does her children harm if she makes them the only concern of her life. I think you're quite right. And the fact remains that they worship me. I've noticed that. You're their ideal of all that's graceful and beautiful and wonderful, but they're not cozy and they're at ease with you as they are with Gray. They worship you, that's true, but they love him. He's very lovable. I liked her for saying that. One of her most amiable traits was that she was never affronted by the naked truth. After the crash, Gray went all to pieces. For weeks he worked at the office till midnight. I used to sit at home in agony of fear. I was afraid he'd blow his brains out. He was so ashamed. You see, they'd been so proud of the firm. His father and Gray, they were proud of their integrity and the sureness of their judgment. He wasn't so much that we'd lost all our money that he couldn't get over was that all those people who trusted him had lost theirs. He felt that he ought to have had more foresight. I couldn't get him to see that he wasn't to blame. Isabel took a lipstick out of her bag and painted her lips. But that's not what I wanted to tell you. The one thing we had left was the plantation, and I felt that the only chance for Gray was to get away. So we parked the children with Mama and went down there. He'd liked it, but we'd never been there by ourselves. We'd taken a crowd up with us and had a grand time. Gray's a good shot, but he hadn't the heart to shoot 'em. He used to take a boat and go out in the marsh by himself for hours at a time and watch the birds. He'd wander up and down the canals with pale rushes on each side of him and only the blue sky above. On some days, the canals are as blue as the Mediterranean. He used not to say much when he came back. He'd say it was swell, but I could see what he felt. I knew that his heart was moved by the beauty and the vastness and the stillness. There's a moment just before sunset when the light on the marsh is lovely. He used to stand and look at it, filled him with bliss. He took long rides in the solitary, mysterious woods. They're like the woods in a play of Maeterlinck's, so gray, so silent. It's almost uncanny. And there's a moment in spring. It hardly lasts more than a fortnight, when the dogwood burst into flower and the gum trees burst into leaf in their young, fresh green against the gray. Spanish moss is like a song of joy. The ground is carpeted with great white lilies and wild azalea. Gray couldn't say what it meant to him, but it meant the world. He was drunk with the loveliness of it. Oh, I know I don't put it well, but I can't tell you how moving it was to see that great hulk of a man uplifted by an emotion so pure and so beautiful that it made me want to cry. If there's a God in heaven, Gray was very near him then. Isabel had grown a trifle emotional. Well, she told me this, and taking a tiny handkerchief, she carefully wiped away a tear that glistened in the corner of each eye. "Aren't you romanticizing?" I said, smiling. "I have a notion that you're ascribing to Gray's thoughts and emotions that you would have expected him to have. How should I have seen them if they hadn't been there? You know what I am. I'm never really happy unless I feel the cement of a sidewalk under my feet, and there are large plate glass windows all along the street with hats to look at, and fur coats and diamond bracelets and gold-mounted dressing cases." I laughed, and we were silent for a moment. Then she went back to what we'd been talking about before. "I'd never divorce Gray. We've been through too much together, and he's absolutely dependent upon me. It's rather flattering, you know, and it gives you a sense of responsibility. And besides what?" She gave me a sidelong glance, and there was a roguish twinkle in her eye. I had a notion she didn't quite know how I would take what she had in mind to say. He's wonderful in bed. We've been married for 10 years, and he's as passionate of a lover as he was at the beginning. Didn't you say in a play once that no man wants the same woman longer than 5 years? Well, you didn't know what you were talking about. Gray wants me as much as when we were first married. He made me very happy in that way, although you wouldn't think it to look at me. I'm a very sensual woman. You're quite wrong, I would think it. Well, it's not an unattractive trait, is it? On the contrary, I gave her a searching look. Do you regret you didn't marry Larry 10 years ago? No, it would have been madness. But of course, if I'd known then what I know now, I'd have gone away and lived with him for 3 months, and then I'd have gone out and got it out of my system for good and all. I think it's lucky for you didn't make the experiment. You might have found yourself bound to him by bonds you couldn't break. I don't think so. It was merely a physical attraction, you know. Often the best way to overcome desire is to satisfy it. Has it ever struck you that you're a very possessive woman? You've told me that Gray has a deep strain of poetic feeling, and you've told me that he's an ardent lover, and I can well believe that. Both mean a lot to you, but you haven't told me what means much more to you than both of them put together. Your feelings that you hold him in the hollow of that beautiful but not so small hand of yours. Larry would always have escaped you. Do you remember that ode to Keats? Bold lover, never, never cast thou kiss, though thou winning near the goal. You often think you know a great deal more than you do, she said, a trifle acidly. There's only one way a woman holds a man, and you know it. And let me tell you this. It's not the first time she goes to bed with him that counts. It's the second. If she holds him then, she holds him for good. You do pick up the most extraordinary bits of information. I get around and I keep my eyes and ears open. May I inquire how you acquired that one? She gave me her most teasing smile. From a woman I made friends with at a dress show. The Verdeuse told me she was the smartest kept woman in Paris. So I made up my mind I'd get to know her. Adrienne de Troyes. Ever heard of her? Never. How your education has been neglected. She's 45 and not even pretty, but she looks much more distinguished than any of Uncle Elliot's duchesses. I sat down beside her and put on my impulsive little American girl act. I told her I had to speak to her because I've never seen anyone more ravishing in my life. I told her she had the perfection of a Greek cameo. The nerve you've got. She was rather stiff at first and standoffish, but I ran on in my simple, naive way, and she thawed. Then we had quite a nice little chat. When the show was over, I asked her if she wouldn't come to lunch with me at the Ritz one day. I told her I'd always admired her wonderful chic. Had you ever seen her before? Never. She wouldn't lunch with me. She said they had such malicious tongues in Paris, it would compromise me. But she was pleased that I had asked. And when she saw my mouth quiver with disappointment, she asked me if I wouldn't come to lunch with her at her house. She patted my hand when she saw I was simply overwhelmed by her affability. And did you go? Of course I went. She has a dear little house over on Avenue Fourchen. We were waited on by a butler who was the very image of George Washington. I stayed till 4 o'clock. We took our hair down and our stays off and had thorough girls' gossip. I learnt enough that afternoon to write a book. Why didn't you? It's just the sort of thing to suit Ladies' Home Journal. You fool, she laughed. I was silent for a moment. I pursued my thoughts. I wonder if Larry was ever really in love with you, I said presently. She sat up. Her expression lost its amenity. Her eyes were angry. What are you talking about? Of course he was in love with me. Do you think a girl doesn't know when a man is in love with her? Oh, I dare say he was in love with you after a fashion. He didn't know any girl so intimately as he knew you. You'd played around together since you were children. He expected himself to be in love with you. He had the normal sexual instinct. It seemed such a natural thing that you should marry. There wouldn't have been any particular difference in your relation except that you lived under the same roof and went to bed together. Isabel, to some extent mollified, waited for me to go on, and, knowing that women are always glad to listen when you discourse upon love, I went on. Moralists try to persuade us that the sexual instinct hasn't got very much to do with love. They're apt to speak of it as if it were a epiphanium. What in God's name is that? Well, there's psychologists who think that the consciousness accompanies brain processes and is determined by them, but doesn't itself exert any influence on them. Something like a reflection of a tree in water. It couldn't exist without the tree, but it doesn't in any way affect the tree. I think it's all stuff and nonsense to say that there can be love without passion. When people say love can endure after passion is dead, they're talking of something else. Affection, kindliness, community of taste and interest, and habit. Especially habit. Two people can go on having sexual intercourse from habit in just the same way as they grow hungry at the hour they're accustomed to have their meals. Of course, they can be desire without love. Desire isn't passion. Desire is a natural consequence of the sexual instinct, and it isn't of any more importance than any other function of the human animal. That's why women are foolish to make a song and dance if their husbands have an occasional flutter when the time and the place are propitious. Does that apply only to men? I smiled. If you insist, I'll admit that what is sauce for the gander is sauce for the goose. The only thing to be said against it is with a man his passing connection of that sort has no emotional significance, while with a woman it has. It depends on the woman. I wasn't going to let myself be interrupted. Unless love is passion, it's not love, but something else, and passion thrives not on satisfaction, but on impediment. What do you suppose Keats meant when he told the lover on his Grecian urn not to grieve? Forever wilt thou love, and she be fair. Why? Because she was unattainable. And however madly the lover pursued, she still eluded him. For they were both imprisoned in the marble of what I suspect was an indifferent work of art. Your love for Larry and his for you were as simple and natural as the love of Paolo and Francisca or Romeo and Juliet. Fortunately for you, it didn't come to a bad end. You made a rich marriage, and Larry roamed the world to find out what the song of the siren sang. Passion didn't enter into it. How do you know? Passion doesn't count the cost. Pascal said that the heart has its reasons, and that reason takes no account of. If he meant what I think he meant, that when passion seizes the heart, it invents a reason that seemed not only plausible but conclusive to prove that the world is well lost for love. It convinces you that honor is well sacrificed and that shame is a cheap price to pay. Passion is destructive. It destroyed Antonio and Cleopatra, Tristan and Isidore, Parnell and Quixote, and if it doesn't destroy, it dies. It may be then that one is faced with the desolation of knowing that one had wasted the years of one's life, that one brought disgrace upon oneself, endured the frightful pang of jealousy, swallowed every bitter mortification that one expended all one's tendencies, poured out all the riches of one's soul on a poor drab, a fool, a peg on which one hung one's dreams, who wasn't worth a stick of chewing gum. Before I finished this harangue, I knew very well that Isabel wasn't paying any attention to me, but was occupied with her own reflections. But her next remark surprised me. "Do you think Larry's a virgin?" "My dear, he's 32. "I'm certain he is. How can you be?" "That's the kind of thing a woman knows instinctively. I knew a young man who has a very prosperous career for some years by convincing one beautiful creature after another that he'd never had a woman. He said it worked like a charm. I don't care what you say. I believe in my intuition. It was growing late. Gray and Isabel were dining with friends, and she had to dress. I had nothing to do, so I walked in the pleasant spring evening up the Boulevard Raspail. I have never believed very much in women's intuition. It fits in too neatly with what they want to believe to persuade me that it is trustworthy, and as I thought of the end of my long talk with Isabel, I couldn't help but laugh. It put me in the mind of Suzanne Rouvier, and it occurred to me that I hadn't seen her for several days. I wondered if she was doing anything. If not, she might like to dine with me or go to a movie. I stopped the prowling taxi and gave the address of her apartment.